typically wars help economies. Wars increase production. They put people to work, even though that is work, killing, and dying. And the war was a huge economic boom for the North. The Republican Party was not only a party that did not want to see the expansion of slavery, but what it fundamentally was a pro-business party, a pro-corporation party. In fact, that's why they opposed slavery. It wasn't a civil rights issue at all. The Republican Party of the North saw slave labor as competition to wage slave labor, the corporate system of hiring people and giving them horrible working conditions, often deadly working conditions, and paying them almost nothing. They saw slave labor as a threat to that, which is why the Republican Party didn't want to see the expansion of slavery. And so the Republicans set to work right away when they take power in 1860 or 1861, putting together a pro-business initiative. They were corporatist. In 1862, they passed the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act. Now, the Homestead Act guaranteed 160 acres of land in exchange for a small fee. And after living on the land for 5 years, the homesteader, the person who had moved onto that land, would gain title to that land. That would become their land. And this gave opportunity to many people who wanted a better life. They could go out west, and they could get cheap land. They could work to improve the land, and then the land would be given to them by the government. The Morrill Act gave each state federal land for the purpose of establishing universities. And so the land would be set aside, and the income from that land would go to pay for a college. Here in Texas, where we live, this would fund would fund Texas A&M University. But if you look, the red dots here are all Morrill Act universities. Now, some of them obviously don't come along until later, the University of Hawaii, for example, but they're all based on the 1862 Morrill Act. And essentially everything you see on this map that was a state at the time the Morrill Act was passed in 1862, all those red dots in those areas, were founded based on the Morrill Act at the time. These universities tended to focus on agricultural and mechanical, which is why Texas A&M is what it is, universities. The idea was to train farmers. This was how we were going to expand and harness the wealth of the land of the West. The highest tariffs in history will be passed. Remember, tariffs help American corporations because they kill competition from foreign sources. But they hurt farmers who rely heavily on imported goods. The Republicans are also going to charter the Union Pacific Railroad, which is going to eventually, remember we talked about the 3 routes before, Chicago, New Orleans, and one coming out of St. Louis. Eventually they're going to build the railroad. Basically, it's going to run from Chicago and St. Louis, and it's going to begin construction out of Omaha, Nebraska. Of course, there's no reason to build it in the South anymore. The South seceded, so who cares? The New Orleans route is off the table. It's called the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific will be built heading out of San Francisco and heading the other direction. So the red line is going to be moving east, the blue line is going to be moving west, and they're going to meet in the middle. In fact, they'll meet in 1869 at a Promontory Peak, where the head of the railroad there will drive in a golden spike. Promontory Point, excuse me. On May 10th, 1869. One of the amazing things about this is this railroad was largely built, the eastern part of the railroad was built with Irish labor. The western part of the railroad was built with Chinese laborers, both working under horrible and often deadly conditions. When they take the picture, all the businessmen will tell all the workers to get out of the picture. The Irishmen and the Chinese guys will not be put into the picture that will be published in the papers, even though they're one that actually did the work to build it. The National Banking Act in 1864 gave banks the authority to issue treasury notes if they invested 1/3 of their capital into federal securities, which essentially meant that banks could now print money. Again, this was a huge boon to banks and corporations, as it gave them a great deal more financial power and ability to make money using the government's good name. These are all very, very corporatist or pro-corporate policies. And of course, they're going to have 2 effects. They're going to devastate and brutalize the life of working men and farmers, the high tariffs particularly. And they're also going to dramatically increase the profitability of American corporations and banking. Now, I'm going to talk about this in class, but if you're not in my class, you want to pause and look at this cartoon. It's pretty great. The war has to be paid for. Wars are expensive. And they did this through 3 ways. They levied taxes. They did increase taxes. In fact, we've increased taxes in every single war except the most recent ones in Iraq and Afghanistan. Issuing paper money, and borrowing. Paper money, by the way, means money that is not backed by gold, money you can't trade in for gold. And the first money America ever issued that couldn't be backed by gold are called greenbacks, and there you see some pictures of them there. This is called fiat money. And so a lot of people like to look back to the invention of the Fed in the 19-teens, which we'll talk about when we get there, as kind of the death knell of the American banking system. But this really begins in the Civil War. The taxes barely make a dent. An income tax is imposed for the very first time, but it pays for almost nothing. The greenbacks, by the way, the paper money, is going to be considered to be dramatically less valuable than the other money, the money that's backed by gold. In 1864, a greenback, which was supposed to be the equivalent of the other money, was only worth 39 cents of a regular note. By the end of the war, that number is up to 67 cents. But again, the greenback is considered to be worth less. But ultimately, the government borrowed the money. We sold $400 million in bonds. And in total, the government borrowed $2.6 billion to pay for the Civil War. This is the Northern government. Again, I'll go over this in class if you're in my class, but if you want to pause it and look at it, there's a great cartoon. You see the guy printing money over there. That's Salmon Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury. In 1861, there were 16,000 American troops. Most of them were in the West. Lincoln calls for 23,000 more troops. Congress calls for 500,000 volunteers for 3-year terms. And at first, enthusiasm is high and quite a few men sign up. But by March of 1861, so we're talking here just a month later, people stop signing up for the most part. In 1861, Congress decides to draft soldiers. You could avoid the draft, by the way, for paying $300. By paying $300, a fine essentially to not get drafted, or hiring a replacement. If you were wealthy, you could hire a poor person to take your place. Remember, this is a very pro-wealthy corporatist government. For most, the Civil War and the draft was the first major interaction with the federal government they ever had. It's important to understand that it's really under Lincoln that we have our first big government. Not only the idea that government can take away property, slaves, which most people agree with today, but things like income taxes and paper money and the draft and other examples that we're going to see going along, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act. This is really the birth of big government. People tend to think that FDR was the birth of big government, but that's not really true. It's Lincoln. This scared them. The idea that the government could come snatch you up and make you go fight in the war freaked people out. And the fact that really it was only laborers and immigrants who were having to go fight because rich people could get out of it by paying money really bothered people. Democrats, of course, also opposed the war and hated the draft. And there were riots all throughout the North. For 4 bloody days in July of 1863, New York City was rocked with violence. They actually went around lynching African Americans. These are Northerners in New York City, blaming blacks for the war, lynched African Americans in one of the darkest episodes in American history, burnt down a black orphanage, killing more than 100 kids. U.S. troops had to actually return from the Battle of Gettysburg to put down this riot.